Okay, so the next thing I wanted to just hit on is this whole idea of the harsh words of Jesus. And I got this idea, got this topic. I was reading through the Gospel of John recently, and all throughout this book, you see these settings where Jesus is speaking to the disciples or speaking to the Pharisees, like the religious leaders, or he's speaking to the crowds, large gatherings of people. And you often see this play out where he's talking about stuff, and then at the end, it it rubs people the wrong way. Like it's forcing people to either accept what he says or reject. Like there's no middle ground. And I think John highlights this tension more than any of the other gospels. We have in John 6, for example, where he's speaking to the crowd, and this is long discourse, and where he's like saying things like, if you don't drink my blood and eat my flesh, like you can't follow me. And I mean, to us, that just sounds disgusting, but to a first century Jew, that's utterly offensive. And so at the end of like that whole discourse and that whole conversation he was having, it said there were all these disciples that were following Jesus end up turning around and walking away because they couldn't handle it. They were like, "Man, like this is harsh. Jesus, the things you're saying are harsh." And so ultimately, all these people, hundreds of his disciples, walk away. And so then Jesus goes to his 12. He's like, "Are you guys going to go too?" And then Peter, this is where Peter says, "Where else are we going to go? Like, there's nowhere else to go. So we have to accept what you're saying," basically is what Peter was getting at. And so you have the situation where Jesus is speaking and people are left facing this moment of decision. It's like, wow, the stuff that he's saying, this is hard. This is harsh. This is offensive. I don't like it. It's making me feel uncomfortable, poking at me. And it caused them to make this choice of like, am I going to continue following Jesus, or am I going to be like, I can't do it anymore, and walking away? It forced them to make this decision. And then in John chapter 10, we see it happen again, where this is where Jesus talks about how he's the door, and he talks about how he's the good shepherd, and how he's not a hired hand. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep, and my sheep know my voice, and goes through um this famous message. But then in verse 19 of John 10, we read this. It says, dissension occurred again among the Jews because of these words. And dissension occurred again. And many of them were saying he has a demon and is insane. But then others were saying, these are not the words of someone who's demon possessed, because a demon cannot open the eyes of the blind. So again, Jesus has this whole conversation and people are left. This dissension broke out amongst the crowd, and you have people saying he's either an insane demon possessed person, he's crazy, or in fact, he's God. It's like one or the other. And John highlights this tension, um, especially in his gospel account, I think more than the others, as I mentioned. And it just got me thinking about like the current church. And when you hear or when you see, I guess, a lot of the more famous, more popular preachers, pastors, Christian leaders out there who have their stuff on a global, uh, a global platform where you have millions of people seeing them, hearing them, and all that. And when you hear them talk about Jesus, and it's like, do we really see this tension today in the church? Where it's like when people hear the gospel and they hear pastors talk about who Jesus is, what he's done, are people left with that same kind of decision to make where it's like, well, he's either a crazy demon possessed insane person or he's God. Because I think that the pull is to make the gospel, make talking about Jesus more palatable. And yeah, I do think there's multiple ways and creative ways where you can present the gospel message and all that. But at the heart, at the foundation of it, there's no middle ground. There's no like creating this narrative where Jesus is just this nice, soft, gentle dude who's just this all loving, and we kind of have created this nice Jesus because we don't want to offend people. We are so afraid of offending people in our modern world just because of how our society's gone with censorship and this trying to preach inclusivity, where truth is subjective to the person, and you can't step on anyone's toes, and you have to accept everybody just the way they are, no matter what they say, think, or believe. And we're so afraid of offending people, so we have to create our messages. And when we talk about the Bible, we talk about Jesus, we have to say it in such a way that's just non-offensive, non-invasive, where people are willing to sit and listen and not be offended. And we're so afraid of that. And it's like Jesus did not care about that. When you see how, especially John has put his gospel together, he didn't care about his original hearers, first century church who was listening to this or not listening, or reading it or hearing it, that at the end they're going to feel offended. Jesus didn't care. He's having this massive conversation with this large crowd. He did not care at the end that hundreds of them are walking away. He still said what needed to be said. He wasn't afraid to offend people. Dissension occurred again among the Jews because of these words. Jesus is point blank saying, I'm the good shepherd. I'm the light of the world. I'm the door. I am. That phrase there, he's referencing when Yahweh in the Old Testament said to Moses, when Moses is asking God, okay, well, who do I say is sending me to Pharaoh? And God says, well, tell Pharaoh, I am sending you. Just as what Jesus is, he's making himself God here. He's equating himself with God. And people say, how come Jesus doesn't declare that he's God? Well, that's how he did it here. And so he's not afraid, point blank, saying, I'm the door, I'm the good shepherd, I'm the light of the world, I am. And dissension occurred among the Jews because of these words, where people were saying, dude's either demon possessed and is insane, or he actually is God. Like, that's the choice. And I look at our church and it's like people who've never heard the gospel, who've never heard, preaching about Jesus, I don't see them being confronted with that reality where the truth of who Jesus is and what he's done is being preached unfiltered, not trying to dress it up in such a way as to not offend people, but like actually being preached with no fear. And then at the end, letting people decide what they're going to think about it. If people get offended, get angry, they get up and walk out, so be it. But at least the truth was preached. Now, yes, you preach in love. I'm not saying you yell. It's not about yelling and screaming and being condemning. It's just not filtering the truth. When it says Jesus is the only way, you can say that in love. You're communicating, but it's communicating the truth. There is only one way. It's not multiple roads. Jesus is the door. Jesus is the good shepherd. Jesus is the I am. Jesus is God. Salvation comes only through him. You can say that in a loving way, but you can still communicate that, and that's the truth. And that's going to create conflict in people's, especially when it's weighed against the culture in which we live in. And so it says dissension occurred because of these words. And it's like people were forced to make a choice about Jesus. They were confronted with his words. And my prayer is that we would get back to that, where we wouldn't care about numbers. We would care about the truth being proclaimed and preached, and people forced to make a choice. And some, there's no pressure on us, because it's like Jesus himself walked the earth, performed countless miracles, signs and wonders, spoke in a way that no one else had ever spoken before. I mean, you see that all throughout the Gospels. He spoke as one with authority, that they've never heard someone speak this way. Had all these massive outdoor crusades, and yet people still walked away from him and ultimately killed him. And that's God himself was saying those words, preaching those words, performing these signs, wonders, and miracles. And it was God himself in the flesh, and people still rejected it. So there's no pressure on us as Christians trying to make people believe. It's not our job. Jesus himself couldn't make everyone believe. And he's God. He simply communicated the truth and gave them a choice, either accept or reject. And so I pray that we get back to that kind of communication, this communicating of the truth, where people, even Christians, because in John 6, they were his disciples that were walking away. It wasn't just the non-believers. I'm sure some non-believers were in that crowd who were just there to witness the miracles. But the disciples themselves, and I think there's a lot of Christians in church, Christians, and I say that in quotes, in church, who have never really heard the true gospel communicated in such a way that would cause them to make that choice. Because I think if the true gospel is communicated and that tension is created, you're going to see how many real Christians are in your churches or fake ones, because the fake ones will ultimately walk away. And so it's not just for unbelievers. It's for people who've gone to church for years, but their faith, man, is very shallow and borderline unlegit. So this is why it's important to communicate the true gospel of who Jesus is and what he's done.